There are moments in a baseball season that don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with fanfare or headline alerts. They arrive quietly, in a medical report, in a coaching decision, in the sound of a glove hitting the ground in the tunnel behind the dugout. This was one of those moments. The Dodgers had just wrapped up another evening under the California sky when the news began to leak out in fragments. Yency Almonte had struggled. The bullpen had shown cracks. And somewhere inside the organization, a conversation had already been happening for days, maybe longer, about what the postseason relief picture was going to look like. Then came the MRI results. Then came the decision about Roki Sasaki. And the story, which had been simmering quietly beneath the surface, finally boiled over. Edwin Diaz had not been himself. Anyone who had watched him closely over the past few weeks could sense it. The electric slider that had once made opposing hitters look foolish was still there, but it was arriving with a fraction less certainty. The fastball command that had defined his best nights was wandering slightly off its usual path. Small things. The kind of things that don't show up in the box score but live very clearly in the eyes of the people watching from the dugout. The MRI confirmed what the Dodgers' medical staff had suspected. The results were not catastrophic. They were careful to say that. Dave Roberts, standing in front of the media with the particular stillness of a man choosing every word with precision, did not use alarming language. He did not reach for dramatic phrasing. He spoke the way managers speak when they are trying to tell the truth without triggering a panic. Diaz would be limited. The severity, and the timeline, were still being evaluated. But the subtext was clear to anyone paying attention. The Dodgers' most trusted late-inning arm, the man they had imagined closing out October games, was no longer a certainty for that role. Not right now. Maybe not in time. The room absorbed that quietly. A reporter asked about the severity once more, and Roberts gave the same careful answer, just rephrased. He wasn't hiding anything. He was simply aware that some information, delivered too bluntly, creates more problems than it solves. Then came the question everyone in the room had been building toward. If not Diaz, then who? Roberts paused. Not a long pause. But long enough to signal that what came next had been thought through. We've been talking about Roki in a different role, he said. Inside the clubhouse, Roki Sasaki had already heard. The people closest to him described the moment differently depending on who was telling the story. Some said he was quiet when he found out. Some said he nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they've been expecting something and still aren't ready for it when it arrives. What they all agreed on was what happened next. He walked toward the back of the tunnel, away from the cameras and the reporters and the organized noise of a major league clubhouse preparing for another game. And somewhere in that tunnel, the glove came off his hand and hit the ground. It wasn't rage. It wasn't a tantrum. It was the kind of release that comes from a man who has spent months building himself into something specific, a starting pitcher, a rotation anchor, a name meant to be spoken alongside the other names at the top of a pitching staff, and who has just been told that the path forward looks different than the one he had been walking. He picked the glove back up. That part matters too. When he spoke to the media later, his voice was measured. The translator worked carefully through each answer. But there were moments where the translation couldn't fully contain what was underneath. I want to be where I can help the team win, he said. But I won't lie and say this was easy to hear. The room didn't react dramatically to those words. But they landed. Because Sasaki had come to Los Angeles with a specific idea of what he was going to be. He had imagined long outings. He had imagined building through a lineup 2 and 3 times. He had imagined, perhaps, what it would feel like to carry a game on his back the way Ohtani carried one earlier this month. That version of this story was being rewritten in real time. Dave Roberts had not made this decision impulsively. The people inside the organization who understood how these conversations worked described it as a process that had begun quietly, almost academically, before the Diaz news had even formally arrived. The Dodgers were already stress-testing their postseason assumptions. They were already asking the hard question that every contender eventually has to ask in September: what do we actually have in the late innings when everything is on the line? The answer, without Diaz at full strength, was uncomfortable. Almonte had shown flashes. Phillips had been solid in stretches. But the Dodgers needed something with a higher ceiling for October. They needed a weapon. Sasaki, Roberts had concluded, was that weapon. His stuff plays in any inning, Roberts said, when a reporter asked him to explain the thinking. We've seen what he can do when he's locked in for one inning. The velocity, the movement, it changes the dynamic of an at-bat. He was careful not to frame it as a demotion. He was careful to use words like evolution and opportunity. But the reporters in the room were experienced enough to know that careful framing, however sincere, doesn't change the underlying reality of what was being asked of a young pitcher who had come to this country with a very specific dream. Roberts was asking him to be something different. He was betting that Sasaki was capable of it. Shohei Ohtani had spoken with Sasaki. This part of the story emerged gradually, through small details offered by people near the situation rather than through any formal announcement. But it was real, and it mattered. Ohtani understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, what it meant to be asked to redefine yourself inside a baseball season. He had done it in ways no one had ever done before. He had walked into lineups as a pitcher and then walked back to the dugout and picked up a bat. He had learned to hold two identities simultaneously and perform at an elite level in both. What he said to Sasaki in private was not shared publicly. But those who knew what had been said described the conversation as honest. Not soft. Not filled with reassurances that everything would be fine. Ohtani did not trade in comfortable fictions. He was the kind of person who respected others enough to tell them what was true. What was true was this: Sasaki's career was not ending. His identity as a pitcher was not being erased. He was being asked to do something extremely difficult, to compress all of his ability into the most pressurized moments of October, and if he did it well, the story that got told about him afterward would be one worth telling. That was the argument. Whether Sasaki fully believed it yet was a different question. Later that evening, the Dodgers made it official. The playoff relief structure, as currently constructed, would see Sasaki slotted into a high-leverage closing role. The rest of the pieces arranged themselves around that decision. Almonte would handle the seventh, with a combination of left-right matchup specialists working the sixth depending on the opposing lineup. The bridge to Sasaki would require precision management. Roberts, when asked about the risk of overloading a young pitcher with closing expectations in October, didn't wave the concern away. There's always risk, he said. But there's also risk in going into the playoffs without someone who can get 3 outs with the game on the line and the best hitters in the world at the plate. He paused. We believe Roki can be that person. The room processed that for a moment. Someone asked about the psychological weight of the role, about whether it was fair to put that kind of pressure on a pitcher still learning American hitters, still finding the edges of his game in this league. Roberts thought about that one longer than the others. Baseball has never been fair, he said. The players who end up being remembered are usually the ones who figured out how to do the unfair thing anyway. The story wasn't finished. It wasn't finished because Diaz's timeline was still uncertain. It wasn't finished because Sasaki had only begun to process what was being asked of him. It wasn't finished because the playoffs were still weeks away, and a baseball season has a habit of rewriting its own conclusions without warning. But something had shifted. The Dodgers had looked at their situation honestly and made a decision that prioritized winning over comfort. They had asked a young man to change the shape of his ambition. They had taken a risk that could look either visionary or reckless depending entirely on what happened when October arrived and the lights got brighter and the at-bats got slower and everything that a pitcher had became the only thing standing between a win and a loss. Sasaki would walk back into that tunnel again. He would pick up the glove that had hit the ground. He would throw his bullpen sessions and study his tendencies and prepare himself for a role he had not planned for. And somewhere across the clubhouse, Ohtani would watch. Not because he doubted, but because he knew, better than anyone, that the moment of transformation never looks clean from the inside. It only looks clean later, when the story has already been written and the hard parts have softened at the edges and what remains is just the result. The result wasn't written yet. But in Los Angeles, on a quiet evening when the news arrived in fragments and a glove hit the ground in a tunnel and a manager chose his words with great care.